Affective?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be back at a language creation conference. I spoke at the first two way back when in Berkeley, 2006 and 2000, well, I guess it was 2006 and 2007, right? It's nice to see some familiar faces and a whole lot of new ones. It's actually really amazing to me that conlanging has suddenly become a big thing in the world. I mean, since my last appearance at a conlang conference, we now have millions, maybe over 1 billion people worldwide hearing Navi being spoken to them from Pandora. Not to mention millions of people watching their televisions, hearing David's Dothraki being spoken, and now recently his Castleton and Erathian languages. I think there's Illyrian in there too. So that just amazes me. Not to mention the fact that an esteemed magazine like the New Yorker would actually feature an article about some guy from LA who had a hobby and created an engineered language and had a lot of adventures and misadventures because of it. So, it's hard to believe. Before I go on with my presentation, I want to thank the organizers again, Alex Sands and the UT people, as well as David and Sylvia Sotomayor, who did a lot of work to get this whole conference off the ground. It's fun to be back here. Anyway, a few months ago I was being interviewed by those same documentarians that are apparently going to be showing up. They had read the New Yorker article about my work and came to interview me about it. And one of the questions they asked me was, what do I think it is that drives conlangers to do what they do? And I don't recall now exactly what it is I said in response, but I do remember that it was quite long-winded, hopefully coherent, certainly intellectual, or more likely pseudo-intellectual. But anyway, if I could answer that question again now, I think I would actually answer it in a much more succinct way with a quote, a very brief quote that I read while I was preparing this presentation. I came across this quote, and that quote is, how do I get to advance?
Arrow button?
Right arrow.
Right arrow. Okay.
This is place 1.
And nothing happens.
Down arrow.
Technology is so hard.
There you go. Thank you. This is a quote I came across while researching this presentation this morning. Speech is the greatest show that man puts on. That's something that our friend Benjamin Lee Whorf said way back in the 1930s or 1940s. And it kind of sums it all up to me. Good old Whorf. There it is. That's the right one. I'm going to be talking a lot about Whorf today, but believe it or not, I'm not going to be talking about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Whorf is famous for a few other things besides the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and specifically, it involves cryptotypes. So I've entitled my presentation, Untightening Your Cryptotypes, and if you have a problem with the word untightening, given that there is no such verb as untighten in English, then we are already on the right track. We're going to talk about why there is no verb untighten in English. So we're going to be talking about covert patterns, advanced oddities, little irrationalities. Currently, in conlangs, most of you who have developed, well-developed conlangs, have gotten to the point where the language is sophisticated enough to have irregularities and quirks like irregular verbs, you have noun classes and genders, you have irregular plural patterns, you have various conjugational classes perhaps, certainly idioms and idiomatic constructions. Many of you have now started to introduce conceptual metaphors into your language. One that I saw recently, Elaine Conlanging, we're going to be looking at a little later, has the equivalent phrase for long ago is many years upward. And the word upward is because this language, this conlang, has a time is water conceptual metaphor. So it's a river. And so, of course, upriver is the past, downriver the future. So they say many years upward to mean long ago. I just love that. That's wonderful. Polysemy, lots of meanings for a single word, non-SVO syntax for those who want to start to get exotic. For those of you who created natural sounding languages that, natural language conlangs, you've gotten into some morpho-syntactic alignment other than Indo-European, so we've got some ergative and trigger languages. You have foreign borrowings from your other conlangs, and certainly you have some, those of you who've developed a history for your conlangs in a proto-language and that sort of thing, have diachronic reflexes and sound shifts. And for those of you who don't know what a diachronic reflex is, this one is demonstrating that for you. Those of you who don't know me don't know about my very odd sense of humor. What we're going to be talking about today is more advanced irregularities and quirks. We're going to be exploring some oddities and things that do occur in natural languages, but do not often occur in conlangs, because they're more subtle, hidden, covert. I've tried to focus on topics that you will not find in the Advanced Language Construction Kit or Thomas Paine's Morpho-Syntax book, the two big Bibles of conlanging, for those of you who know about them. Some of the topics are, in fact, mentioned in those two sources, but not in any expanded way. They're just mentioned, so we're going to explore them a little further. And why are we doing this morning? Because I want to show you some things that natural language does that maybe you haven't looked into and would like to add to your conlang to give it greater realism and verisimilitude. So for those of you who would do philosophical engineered languages, this presentation this morning is not going to be very valuable to you. But for those of you who do natural language style conlangs or planning such, hopefully I'll be able to add some value to your future work. So what are we going to be talking about? I've got a lot of material this morning. We will not get through all of it, not enough time. But we'll get as far as we can. We're going to talk about cryptotypes, covert, ergative, and affective patterning, middle voice patterns, monoactive versus coactive verbs, verb conflation, defective verbs, etc. I'd like to get as far as ideophones, because ideophones are cool. I don't know if we're going to get to the rest of the stuff on this list, but the presentation, I understand, is available online, the slides, so you'll be able to read the rest of them yourself if you're interested. So without further ado, let's talk about cryptotypes. This is a word that Worf invented back in 1936 in an essay, and he calls it a covert morphological or lexical class that has no overt morphological marking for the class, that is important to the grammar, but its meaning is, to use his words, submerged, subtle, and elusive, and native speakers of a language are generally completely unaware of this covert class and unable to explain the rules for its application once you make them aware of it. What's an example? The first one that Worf came up with was the use of the completed particle up in English, meaning to do something completely or to a finish. So we say things like break it up, cover it up, eat it up, twist it up, open it up. And Worf analyzed its distribution and determined that this little up particle can be added to two-syllable verbs that have their accent on the first syllable, except if the verb refers to dispersion without boundary or oscillation without agitation of parts or non-durative impact of psychological reaction. So we can't say spread it up, waste it up, scatter it up. We can't wiggle up a finger. or wave up a flag, and I can't fight up someone or hate him up or stab it up, things like that. And it seems really arbitrary to think about the fact that this can only be applied to two-syllable verbs with an accent on the first syllable. I mean, does that sound arbitrary or not? But such is the nature of a cryptotype. And this is your language that you speak is doing this. So this is the kind of oddity that I'm talking about. The reversative un prefix has a lot of literature written about it as a result of Worf's identifying it as a cryptotype. He found that it applies to transitive verbs of covering, enclosing, and surface attaching, but with lots of exceptions. So we can uncover things and unfasten things and unwind things, but we can't unbreak them or undry them or untighten them. Now, it seems to me if you can tighten a jar, you should be able to untighten the jar. But no, we loosen the jar, we don't untighten it. So. Now, what's interesting about these cryptotypes, such as un, is that changes in culture can change the nature of the cryptotype. For example, recently acceptable verb forms because of the digital age.
Yeah.
As, oops, how do I go back?
Left arrow.
As this man has just discovered. Anyway. Does he look like George Bush to you or not? Anyway. I shouldn't say that in Texas, should I? All right, another cryptotype, the ordering of adjectives. This is another one that Worf discovered. We can say large red house, but we don't say a red large house.
No.
We can talk about a pretty French girl, but we don't talk about her as a French pretty girl. Once again, it seems utterly arbitrary, and yet, if I were to say to you, there's a French pretty girl, if you're a native speaker of English, you can go, yeah, I guess. It just sounds strange. And he determined that inherent, what he called inherent qualities and traits, such as color, material, physical state, breed, nationality, function, use, those have priority over non-inherent qualities in terms of the ordering of the adjectives. Now, you can violate this cryptotype under certain circumstances. Worf found that you can violate it if you change the stress on the adjectives and it's in a context of comparison and contrast. So I can say there's the French pretty girl as opposed to the Spanish pretty girl. So these are the kinds of things that we do and say every day, of course, and never think about. More cryptotypes. Verbalizer, nominalizer, suffixes. So we can nationalize, but we can't nationify. You know? And these kinds of suffixes turn concrete into abstract, so they should be able to be called abstractifiers. There's no such word as abstractify. I could use a verb like abstractify. I mean, I'd make use of that one if it existed in our language. Why do we have redness but not fatness? Widowhood but not windowhood? And if something that grows displays growth, why isn't it the case that something that withers displays withers? So when you go to make your conlangs, of course, and you begin translating your nominalizer affixes, you may be thinking, okay, I'll have 3 of them for variety's sake, but think also about having forms that would exist and should exist, but don't exist. You know, so don't necessarily create a word for growth, even though you have grow, or the opposite, no word withers, etc. In order to display these kinds of odd distributions of morphemes. This is a morphological construction in English that Thomas Paine talks about in his work describing morphosyntax, but he doesn't really get into the irregularities of it. English has the ability, in very, very restricted cases, to create words like pickpocket, someone who picks pockets, or scarecrow, something that scares a crow, or killjoy, which I guess is supposed to mean someone who kills joy. So obviously then a watchdog is someone who watches dogs. And a love child is somebody who loves children, right? So as you can see, the form does not distribute in any kind of, universal way. It seems to be very arbitrary. And if I go to buy a car at a used car lot, who's the guy who approaches me with a big grin on his face? He's a sell car, right? Or should be, anyway. And if I go on a witch hunt, does that make me a hunt witch? Maybe in your conlang, it would be a hunt witch. The Romance languages like to use this construction. Spanish and Italian, French does it too. Spanish tends to use it almost exclusively for appliances around the house. Tocadiscos, literally it plays discs. Abre latas, literally it opens cans. Lavarropas, it washes clothes. Italian tends to have a few words that go outside the appliance range. Rompiscatole, one of my favorite words in Italian, is a pain in the ass, pain in the neck person. Literally, you're breaking boxes. Scatole, I think, can also mean, can. So you break a can breaker, a box breaker. I wonder if it's also, it might be a slang word for what we like to say cojones, So, which would be like English ball breaker, like when Tony Soprano says, hey, you're breaking my balls. The other word, rompigacho, is an icebreaker. It breaks ice, which they also use for an ice pick. Patient nominalization. This is another one identified by Payne in describing morphosyntax. Again, very restricted use in English. It's only used with evaluative adjectives like good or bad, where you take a verb and nominalize it into a noun if it's referring to the patient, the semantic role of patient in the sentence. So the car is a good buy. The book is a boring read. He was a lousy lay. So if I can say the book is a boring read, how come I cannot say this meat or this meal is a good eat, or this film is a boring watch? And I should be able to say your conlang is a great speak. I would love to be able to say that. Your conlang is such a great speak, but you can't say it. So once again, we see this these constraints on the distribution of the construction. Another very rare phenomenon in English is verbal manner nominalization, where we can take certain verbs that refer to the manner in which an action was done and nominalize them in reference to the person who performs the action. So that golfer has a mean slice. I can't hit against his curve. I don't care for Barbra Streisand's warble. And if she can admire my swagger, then why can't I notice her gyrate? I should be able to. Or that butcher has a nice mince. We should be able to say that. And you know that I could not possibly get through a presentation in front of an audience without inserting a clown. Anyway, Worf identified some examples of cryptotypes from Hopi, the Hopi language where he did some field work. One area of which was the inceptive morphology, to begin to do something, to start to do something. Hopi utilizes different affixes on different verbs for its inceptive morphology, and his native informants could not explain to him why the different affixes. So he analyzed it very carefully and determined that the affix you use for inceptive morphology in Hopi depends on whether the particular act that you are applying it to refers to the act that leads to a result versus the resulting state itself. So example being, are you talking about beginning to tear something, or are you talking about something beginning to be torn? And Hopi does not allow you to do both. You have some verbs use one way, others the other. So in your own conlang, you might want to consider, inceptive morphology. How are you going to do it? Are you going to do it like Hopi? Or are you going to do it like English, where it's all just one form that can mean either? Or are you going to use separate morphology? That sort of thing. one for acts leading to the result, one for the resulting state. Finnish shows some cryptotypes as well. Like Indo-European languages, their adjectives define for case and number, in with the nouns, and can also take comparative suffixes, except for certain adjectives. So in Finnish, you cannot take, there's two words for mighty or doughty, and for whatever reason, you can't say mightier using those, or mightiest using those adjectives. You can't say more fitter, more fit. You can't say littler. You have to use some kind of circumlocution instead of what you think would be available. In poetry and especially country music, you see a lot of violations of cryptotypes. So how can I unlove you and unbreak my heart? Shakespeare even got into the act of violating cryptotypes, where he talks about Richard II being unkinged.
Yeah.
So in general, we don't see a cryptotype, and we don't notice it until it's violated. So, okay, new topic, covert ergative patterning. I've got several slides here that get kind of technical. Those of you who know all about ergative versus absolutive languages, this will all make sense to you. Some of you in the audience don't know about that, so I'm going to give you a 1-minute crash course on understanding ergativity. There are generally two kinds of languages in the world when it comes to the relationship between what we think of as a subject of a verb and an object of a verb. Approximately half the languages in the world are nominative accusative languages, like English, most Indo-European languages, where intransitive and transitive subjects of a verb are marked the same, usually nominative case for those languages that use case marking, as opposed to the transitive object of the verb, which is an accusative case. And that's what seems normal to us, and those, if you've studied any common Indo-European language, that's what we've encountered. Irrealis languages as well. On the other hand, there are languages in the world, a little less than half of the languages, that do it differently. They're ergative-absolutive languages, where the two forms that bear the same case marking are the subject of an intransitive sentence and the object of a transitive sentence. They're marked the same, as opposed to the subject of a transitive sentence, which is marked differently using the ergative case. If you want more about this, if it interests you, I recommend strongly the Payne's Describing Morphosyntax, as well as Mark Rosenfelder's Advanced Language Construction Kit. Both resources are really good in explaining in very straightforward terms how ergative languages work. And of course, if you want the Bible on it, there's Dixon's book in the Cambridge series, just simply titled Ergativity. Anyway, with that crash course on ergative patterning, these are the things to remember here, these little illustrations. Marking of the subject of an intransitive sentence and a transitive subject the same, versus marking of the patient as the same as the intransitive subject. We're going to see that these kinds of ergative patterns actually exist in nominative accusative languages, even though we tend to think that the two are mutually exclusive. But in fact, let's take a look at the English able suffix as in perishable or passable, able to be X, or able to be X. With intransitive verbs, it means the former, able to X, able to perish. But with transitive verbs, it means able to be X. So a piece of meat we're going to eat is perishable, but a truck that I'm going to pass, now it's the object, patient, is passable. Well, what we're seeing is that the adjective made with able can only refer to intransitive subjects or transitive objects, but never the subject of a transitive sentence. So its distribution is ergative as opposed to accusative. Same thing with E suffix as in retiree or nominee or parolee can be referred to an intransitive subject of the underlying sentence or a transitive object, but never the transitive subject. A well-dressed man, accused man, the ED suffix operates the same way. So again, you see these weird little ergative patternings in nominative languages. Dutch, and I believe German too, has a construction that it's actually a Valence suppression form that takes subjects away. And as you can see in these examples, their boys are whistling, literally their whistle boys, and then there becomes whistled, meaning whistling is going on. Someone whistled, there's some whistling. But this construction can only refer to animate activities. So you cannot use that second sentence to refer to the whistling of tea kettles or the wind. So given the fact that agents are animate, or as opposed to inanimate, once again, the patterning distribution applies to what can be argued to be an ergative basis. Turkish, as well as Georgian and Quechua, do something interesting with their causative constructions. In the first two sentences there, 1A and 1B, we see an intransitive sentence, the man ran, and we're going to put it as the underlying sentence within a causative construction. We made the man run. And predictably, the word man becomes marked for the accusative in the causative construction. Adam koşturdu. Literally, we make run the man. Man and accusative. However, when we go to make a causative out of a transitive sentence in Turkish, something happens. Let's take the man opened the door. Now we're going to say we made the man open the door. Instead, now the man goes into an oblique case. In Turkish, it's the dative, and it's the door that becomes the object of the sentence. So literally, you're saying, we made open the door to the man. And so, once again, we see that the overt case depends on whether the underlying sentence is transitive or intransitive. Ergative patterning. Georgian does it as well. Quechua does it. They don't use the dative case. I believe they use the comminative case in Quechua. So you're saying, we made the door open with the man, or along with the man. So similar to the whole ergativity thing is unaccusative, what are called unaccusative versus unergative intransitive verbs. So, is it a question? Okay. This is real subtle in English and other Western languages. Some languages mark this more overtly. There's a class of intransitive verbs sometimes called unaccusative, where the subject of such a sentence is a semantic patient, not an agent. It's happening to them as opposed to it being the doer. So the snow melts implies that something melted the snow, the sun, the heat, whatever. The vase broke. Well, vases don't break by themselves. Someone has to push them, or they have to be knocked over, or etc. So when we put them into a past participle, when we use the verb as a past participle in an adjectival way, the past participle modifies the noun with an active meaning: the melted snow, the broken vase, the fallen leader. Now, there's another type of verb, of intransitive verb, called unergative, where this time the subject is the semantic agent. Joe ate, the child sleeps, the girl shouted. They're the one doing it, as opposed to anything doing it for them. And here, the participle cannot modify a noun with an active meaning. So we can't talk about eaten Joe, what we would have to say is Joe having eaten, etc. We can't say the slept child. We have to say the child having slept went out to play. We should be able to say that. The slept child had a good breakfast, but we don't pattern it that way. look what happens when we try to use resultative and verbial adjuncts with these unaccusative versus unergative verbs. With unaccusative, we're allowed to say things like the water spilled onto the floor, the vase broke into pieces, an adverbial complement. But with these unergative verbs, we can't do that. We can't say Joe ate full. We can't say she worked to death. We can say she worked herself to death because then now we have an overt patient referent. It's no longer an intransitive sentence, is what I'm saying. We have to make the sentence transitive in order for it to make sense. He hammered to pieces. We should be able to say that. I hammered to pieces. No, I have to hammer something to pieces. So again, we see this patterning that is ergative in its nature as opposed to nominative accusative. Okay, once again, a different topic, but still talking about semantic roles. Affective verbs. I've always found affective verbs to be a really interesting class of verbs. Those of you who are familiar with colloquial grammar know that I have a lot of morphology dealing with affective verbs. These are verbs of sensation, autonomic bodily states, involuntary physical reactions, unwilled mental or emotional states, such as to see, hear, feel, be hot, be afraid, to cough, flinch, duck, to love, etc. What's the underlying premise that ties all these verbs together? There's no agent. Nobody's consciously doing something to cause a result to happen. Instead, the subject is not a doer. The subject is an undergoer, an experiencer, to use the linguistic phrase. The undergoer of an unwilled state or reaction whose stimulus may be completely unaware of the event. So when I say, I see you, you didn't do anything necessarily. You may be asleep, for example. So you're not an agent, and I'm not doing anything to you. The only thing that's happening is that my retinas are causing something to happen in my brain. So if anyone's the patient, I am. So that's the nature of an affective verb. There are languages that mark these experiencer roles overtly with the dative case, or in 9 of the Northeast Caucasian languages, over in Dagestan, which has been in the news lately, 9 of those languages have a case that's just for this, the affective case of the noun to show the experiencer undergoing the verbal state or action. Now, English and other Indo-European languages don't have any kind of overt morphology whatsoever to deal with affective verbal states and acts, but we have all kinds of covert patterning that relates to affective experiences. So in English, we find lots of constructions that on the surface you think should be grammatical, but are not, because the underlying verb is an affective verb. So we can't say that I shame, and we can say something shames me, it's grammatical, but no native English speaker would say it. Instead, we turn it all into a passive sort of thing. I'm amused at his predicament. We should be able to say his predicament amuses me. And if I were to say it, you'd know what I mean. But it's not a sentence that a native speaker is going to necessarily say. We prefer the passive form. And we certainly can't turn it into I amused at his predicament. In Russian, all such verbs, mental state verbs, are naturally reflexive, other languages too. Finnish, verbs of compulsion require the subject to be in the genitive case, which historically was an old dative case, and we saw how dative marking is associated with affective verbs. So I must go, we see the form minun for I, which is dative case, as opposed to minat, which would be, I believe that's correct, would be nominative case usually. So there's an obligation of going, affecting me, as opposed to I doing something as an agent. Also, verbs of hunger, thirst, being hot, being cold require the subject to be genitive case in Finnish as opposed to nominative. Most of you who've looked at any other foreign languages know that the English verb to like is atypical in being an active form. They would say, I like it. Most other languages do it with turn it into anything but an active sentence. Spanish, me gusta, it pleases me. Italian, the same thing. German, the same thing, it pleases me. It's just not tolerated as an agent. So it is liked by me, it pleases me, as you can see. Other examples, you see I am cold in English as opposed to anything like I cold or I am colden or anything like that. In German, expressly marked for dative, mir es kalt, as opposed to ich, say ich bin kalt. They're saying to me it is cold. French and Spanish, other Romance languages turn it into a possessive situation. I have cold. Affective states start to get into the realm of they start to overlap with certain grammatical constructions that reinforce states of personal responsibility. One of my absolute favorite sentences in the world comes from Spanish. Se me perdió la cartera. All right? Now, it is possible, I'm not a native speaker of Spanish, but I know enough Spanish I know that it is grammatically acceptable in Spanish to say, perdí mi cartera. Literally, I lost my wallet. But no native Spanish speaker is going to say it that way. They're going to say, se me perdió la cartera. The wallet lost itself to me. What a wonderful way of avoiding personal responsibility. It's just like, it just flew away. So, and lots of languages do these kinds of valence changes to totally suppress the participant who would otherwise be considered personally responsible for the situation. Negative sentences are also ripe for constructing different morphology that avoids activity or active kind of construction. So we get in Finnish the direct object of a negative sentence will be declined in the partitive case as opposed to the accusative. Partitive being, meaning part of something or not the whole thing being involved. Which relates very often semantically to not being fully responsible for something. Russian negative sentences, the direct object is in the genitive case. Notice what happens in English with negation. We can say a sentence, a car passed by. In theory, the negative should be, a car didn't pass by. And again, if I were to say that to you, you'd understand what I meant, and it would be considered grammatical. But no native English speaker is going to say a car didn't pass by. They're going to say no car passed by, or not a car passed by. Same thing, something happened, something didn't happen. Once again, negative doesn't allow for the standard grammatical patterning. So think about negation in your languages. Go a little bit further, potentially than just, okay, my negator particle is, ve. I'll just put that at before the verb, or at the beginning of the sentence. Think about the fact that with a negated sentence, you're now creating an irrealis situation, something that never occurred. If it didn't occur, then it has a different cognitive sense of reality. So, how are we doing time? Yeah, we started late anyway. Anyway, let me try to get to ideophones, and then I'll middle voice patterning. This is something you want to consider in your conlang. Certain verbs allow you to use them intransitively to create a situation where the agent is completely suppressed. So we say Robert flies the airplane beautifully, or we can say the airplane flies beautifully. Notice this is not a passive sentence. It's not the airplane is flown beautifully. It's completely restructured to have the object of the first sentence now be the subject of the second sentence, as if the plane did it by itself. The engineer increased the pressure, thus the pressure increased. I molded the soft clay molded easily. So, We have exceptions to this all over the place in English, thus showing patterning of a cryptotype. So even though I can say the soft clay molded easily, I can't say the fence painted yellow. I can't say, I can notice a storm on the horizon, but a storm can't notice on the horizon. Fans buy beer a lot at baseball games. So I should be able to say beer buys a lot at baseball games, but no, we have to change the verb to sell. So once again, we see constraints on the patterning. How will you handle this covert middle voice patterning? In the Romance languages, you see it all becomes reflexive construction. Se habla español, le digo souvent bien. Or you can use dummy impersonal pronouns like French and German do, French man, which just means like one. One speaks German here, same in French. Certain languages have overt middle voice morphology. And, or you can do it as a cryptotype class of verbs like English does. Also consider having diachronic reflexes of former middle voice morphology in your proto-language or ancestor languages. This is seen in Latin and Swedish. Latin and Swedish have a class of verbs called deponent verbs, which are essentially passive voice verbs morphologically in terms of grammar, but semantically are completely active verbs. And those are reflexes of a former middle voice that used to exist. We see this also in the Romance languages as well as early modern English, with using different auxiliary verbs with participles depending on whether that verb is unaccusative or unergative. Remember those from a few slides ago. So in early modern English, we say things like he is come as opposed to he has come. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead. You guys can read about this in the online slides, coactive verbs. I want to get to ideophones because those are really cool. Oh yeah, she's learning all about coactivity. Affective verbs. Ideophones. There are two things that linguists call ideophones that have literally almost nothing to do with each other. The word is used two different ways. One of the ways it's used is to refer to sound symbolism or mimetic words. This is your English yakety yak, hippity hop, gobbledygook, yada yada, Austin, schmostin. Japanese has a lot of these words. They're very often onomatopoeic. Vietnamese has it. Tamil has tons of these ideophones, these sound symbolic words. More interesting is the other type of idiophone, what I call morphological ideophones. These are very specialized adverbial complements that are extremely constrained in their distribution. Very often can be used only with one or two verbs in the language. I'll start with a third example because there's an English counterpart to it. The Hausa language in Africa, in Nigeria, has a word butok, which can only be used with the verb fito to come out, to emerge, in a sentence like ya fito butok, he emerged stark naked. Now, this Hausa has a root for nakedness that doesn't appear in the sentence at all. You instead use this word that's only used with the verb fito, come out. And interestingly enough, in English, the translation of that sentence shows a similar idiophone. Our use of the word stark. In English, the adjective stark is pretty much productive. His prospects for the future were stark. He was in a stark predicament. But when we use stark as an adverb, qualifying another adjective, as far as I can tell, correct me if someone else can think of an example, we can only use stark in two situations, stark naked and
Stark mad.
With the word raving, to say stark raving mad or
Yes.
stark raving loony.
Contrast.
yeah, but that's not, that's just an adjective.
Okay.
With an adjective, there's no problem. But with an adverb, we can only put it in front of naked or mad, and then we have to use raving. So it's extremely limited distribution, and that's what a morphological idiophone does. We should be able to say, I'll say things like it was stark red or stark heavy, but can't do it. There's no reason we can't, but we can. And so think about these ideophones, putting ideophones into your Natlang style conlang, these words that just exist in extremely constrained environments. English has certain profane adverbial complements that are highly constrained. Like what the hell, what the F have you done? And I don't effing believe this. You know, very constrained. Examples from Hishkariana down in Brazil, it has a lot of these morphological idioms. I want to get to the comments. I should probably do that now. Okay, let me, the rest of this presentation you can see in the slides that are online. I've got lots more material here, folk etymology, neologisms. Okay, let's look at some conlangs. As I said earlier, most conlangs don't display, at least the ones I've looked at, and I've looked at a lot of them, don't display many of these kinds of covert, very subtle kinds of irregularities and oddities. But a few do. And there's our friend Aaron Toivo up in Seattle. I think he goes by the name Radius Solus on the ZBB. He's got a lot of languages, very well developed, really sophisticated conlangs. And a few of them have some oddities that are worth looking at. He's got a language called Ndakta, where he has a particle ta included in the name of the language. A very limited distribution. It's applicable to almost any part of speech, but very constrained on which verbs and things it goes with. And it imparts an aspect that he calls dynamic, but its meaning is not always predictable. So with to be, adenta means to become, have, plus ta means to get. With the ethnonym of his people, his Khan people, the Zak, adding ta means now their language and culture, in other words, their dynamic aspect of the people. So that's a very interesting little particle there that doesn't really fall into any real standard kind of grammatical category. He's got another language called Jamna Kopyai, where he has a class of verbs called naked verbs that are unable to. What I've done here is I mapped out the usual structure of his verbs here, but he's got these naked verbs that don't follow this pattern. They're very few. They don't take most of the prefixes, and he even has a historical reason why these verbs developed this way. So that's something worth taking a look at. Our friend Jan Strasser, or maybe it's Jan Strasser, has a language called Tamashare, I guess. It allows argument postposing that moves core arguments to the end of a clause. It's not common. It uses a rhetorical device in storytelling and upper register speech, as well as colloquially to convey enthusiasm or surprise. But it has a lot of restrictions on its use. I won't go into the details, you can read about them here, or you can find his grammar online and get the details. Martin Postumus, who's at the University of Chicago, has a language called Alashian, where there's a particle, ya, that it looks similar to a feminine singular affix and thus causes feminine singular agreement. And it's used to create plurals out of certain certain broken, starts to get complicated. And the main point I want to make about it is that there are restrictions on its use, which of course then starts to turn it into a cryptotype sort of situation, where can't use inanimate nouns, that sort of thing. Our friend Karen Badham, she's on the East Coast somewhere, one of the Carolinas, I think, has a language called race-do, where this goes as a direct reflection on one of the slides I didn't show you, where certain the range, lexicosemantic range of words, like to be, for example, or the English can, to be able, has about 6 different meanings in English. The verb to get in English has about 12 different meanings, which are not necessarily predictable in any way and are rather arbitrary. So this is a language where all the different meanings of to be that we usually think of have different verbs associated with them. So a verb for to exist, as opposed to be the same as in he is the baby, as opposed to we are people, meaning you belong to a specified class or group, etc., etc. Our friend Jona Frost, who's from Slovenia, although I think he studies at the University of Edinburgh at the moment, has a language called High Aeolic. This is an amazing grammar, really beautifully written, very detailed, if you look it up somewhere. And it has a very small class of verbs that require a patient to be in the genitive case. He also has these 2, what he calls truth value focus particles, that do these really funky things. And I wish I had time to explain it to you, but I've run out of time, so I have to rush through this. Our friend Zachary Hart, who is in the audience. Zach? Yay. Zach has a language called Gomine, which has an amazing grammar, although it's extremely hard to find. I don't know why you don't make it more visible. And there's several versions of it. The one that is the more complete one is the December 12th version. Put it somewhere where people can find it on a Google search. Beautifully written, beautifully presented grammar. And it has this little particle, a little thing, a little affix or particle, ST. And I wish I had time to explain it to you, but I've run out of time. Just it does some amazing things in very cryptotypic ways, but in a very coherent way, where certain verbs that take it are required to take it in certain constructions, and it's all there.
You should put the URL to this.
There's a language called Himaswa by Lee Wilson, where all verbs belong to one of 3 distinct aspectual classes: dynamic, perfect, and stative. Nothing, too bizarre about that, but because of this, it creates some semantic variety, and it gets complicated once again, and I don't have the time to show you. But if you look up his grammar, Himaswa, and look into his verbs, he also has some amazing, it uses ideograms for its writing system. They're really, really beautiful. I recommend looking at that. So, to sum it all up, you should go forth, and like my cat says, and untighten, covertize, and modify your conlang up, and make it a really good speech.
Keep that up there so we can copy that. Keep it up. Don't take it away.
Okay, we're going to have some time for some questions, but probably not as many as you'd like, but John will be here for a while. I saw Ted first.
So would it be fair
Wait.
Yes.
So would it be fair to describe a cryptotype as rules that don't apply universally for no particular reason?
I wouldn't say no particular reason, because as Worf showed, there's probably a cognitive basis way down deep somewhere for why the cryptotype exists. And I bet you if you explore this whole thing of cryptotypes from a cognitive linguistics perspective, you probably could find some underlying deep-seated subconscious reasons for the cryptotype, at least in some cases. But on the surface and consciously, certainly you'd say for no reason.
conlang,
No, not at all.
cryptotypes, because they're not conscious. And if you're writing creating a conlang and you specify it, all of a sudden it becomes part of the overt grammar.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, what you would do is you'd handle it the way, no, I don't want to start a linguistics war.
Do it.
I promised myself I wouldn't say anything against Chomsky. I already violated that, obviously. I would just put it in your conlang as good old exceptions to the rule. The following verbs are exceptions to the above rule and take a different pattern, and they are da-da-da-da-da-da. But don't give the reason, or make the reason so convoluted or culturally based that everyone's just going to scratch their heads and say, I'll just have to memorize this.
Yeah. Oh, no, it wasn't anything very interesting. I just was noticing that you can read that, so untighten, and you can understand it. And what was very interesting to me is that in poetry, you are allowed to do that. So untighten and covertize your conlang, autofy it up and make it a good speak could work in a poem.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved your example with Shakespeare, who does this constantly. And we love him for it, but if we do it, then we're just weird. So
there's an essay in there. They're very observation.
that is permissible in poetry, but not in formal essays.
The key thing to note about that whole issue is that we understand the poem.
Yes.
In other words, the fact that we understand what the verb covertize means, yet our language doesn't allow it. What does that say about human language and cognition and our ability to understand morphology and its relationship to semantics?
And what is that famous passage which says, "King me no king, man me no man"? King me no king, man. I can't remember the passage. But I think it's in King Lear.
Yeah, my Shakespeare's rusty myself, so I can't help it.
I want to ask real quick. Earlier you were saying you can't say "I shame" or "I amuse," but it changes when you add, say, "easily," like "I shame easily" or "I amuse easily." What's happening
Oh
there?
my gosh.
What is happening? All right, where are the linguistics professors? Doug, what's your opinion on what's happening with "I shame easily" versus "I shame"? A generative grammarian would be a little flummoxed to try to.
So you have
I
this
did get it wrong.
thing, it's called the middle, and it uses, or it occurs quite widely, but it seems to obligatorily require an adverb, which is
To obligatorily require an adverb. What does that sound like? It sounds like it should be one of my slides. Right?
You got the middle.
So think about your conlang. My gosh, verbs that obligatorily require an adverb. I mean, who would think of that? What newbie or even non-newbie conlanger just throwing their language together as a sketch would think about, oh, and by the way, I'm going to have a class of verbs that require an adverbial complement. This is an example of how natural languages have these wonderful quirks that you can, pick up and start putting into yours.
So if I may make a comment.
Sure.
So as you were talking about lots of your various cryptotypes, I was thinking about particular explanations that at least my linguistic training leads me to be at least suspicious of. So with some of the restrictions of affixes and possibly even the particle up, there could be a factor of prosody. Particular rhythmic structures might only be compatible with either particular affixes or other, shall we say, more loosely but still sort of satellite elements, like up. And the other thing too, with many of the different effects that you talked about, especially with different verbs, I think there might actually be effects of semantic verb class. You talked about there's a particular collection of verbs that only allow these manner type nominalizations, and all of them seem to have an important component of their meaning, the manner, and that might actually be crucial as well. So I would think actually that to have a good NatLang type field to these cryptotypes, you'd actually want to do some investigation as to how natural languages actually structure their cryptotypes and what the generalizations actually are.
So what's your, the lesson to be learned from that comment would be, before you start willy-nilly creating cryptotypes, you might want to have an underlying cognitive basis, that you never make overt. You never overtly stage your grammar, but you should probably have a covert basis psychologically for the cryptotype, to be on the safe side.
I just wanted to sneak in another comment of the same sort, that a possible reason for cryptotypes, like untightening is blocked by the existence of loosen. You've already got loosen, so I mean you don't need the formation untighten, and so you can't make it. Nation-ify is blocked by nationalize. I've heard this kind of analysis of these things. So if
and
there's
I would like to unblock.
Yes. Unblock it, yeah.
Okay. All right, very last question.
Very nice.
Speaking as a poet, I use the prefix "un" where it's not supposed to be used a lot, and other sorts of things. And my answer to the criticism that such and such is not a word, my response is, it is now.
Thank you very much.
And as a result, I'm going to unfriend you.